Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today, love is in the air, and I wanted to take this opportunity to tell you all about my favorite books. Here's my little disclaimer with this. I think favorite books are so difficult to choose. When someone asks me what my favorite book is, when they find out I read, my brain kind of like short circuits a little and I'm like, oh God, I don't know. Like, I usually tailor what I tell them to the person, which I know is like, maybe it's like a people pleasing trait or something. I don't know. I've decided that I'm just gonna make this list, and I didn't spend too long making decisions of what to put on this list. I'm just gonna go with my gut and go with the first thing that kind of comes to my head as far as favorites. And I reserve the right to change my mind at any time, because that's my prerogative. Basically what we're gonna do is I'm gonna go through each genre of genres that I do read and give you my top favorite, because I think that's the best way to organize this. There is a little bit of an exception that we'll talk about when we get there, of a category where I've picked multiple books, but it makes sense. I promise it. It makes sense in my head, at least. So let's get into it. Let's talk about my favorite books, the books that I love with my whole heart. Hopefully this gives you kind of a good sense of my reading taste, and it gives you some recommendations maybe. So we're gonna start off fittingly, I think, with romance. Romance is a genre that I have come to a little bit more recently in my reading journey. But when I got back into reading in 2020, I steered kind of away from the romance books, just because I don't know, I felt like I wouldn't get enough out of them, and that I would feel like there was something missing. Like, I like a romance plot in fantasy, I like a romance plot in historical fiction or in, whatever, but I didn't think I'd like it as its own thing. And I was wrong. You know what? And we learned from our mistake. One of the books that really kind of impacted me more profoundly than I thought any romance book ever would was Book Lovers by Emily Henry. And so this is going to be my favorite romance as of right now. So Book Lovers, I mean, everybody knows Emily Henry. Everybody knows her deal. And Book Lovers is my favorite of hers and my favorite of this genre that I've read. So this book follows Nora, who is a literary agent. And she is convinced by her sister, who is very pregnant, to take a little girls' trip to this teeny tiny town in North Carolina, which is where I live, so that was fun, called Sunshine Falls. And they decided to go to this town because it's featured in books that they've read, as like the sister duo have read in the past. And her sister has this bucket list of things that they need to do while they're on this trip. And Nora kind of reluctantly goes, but she loves her sister a lot. And when she gets there, she realizes that not her nemesis, not really a rival even, but just someone that she has met in the book world, in the publishing world, that she had kind of a negative impression of, named Charlie. And Charlie is there for reasons that, become clear as the book progresses. And of course, the romance plot ensues. And I think there's a few things that kind of hit me about this book. First of all, Nora is a very unique kind of female protagonist for a romance book. She's seen as pretty cutthroat in her job and in her life, and she lives in the city. And the book starts out feeling very much like a Hallmark movie, right? You have the big city business lady who goes to the small town and realizes that she actually doesn't want to be a big city business lady. She wants to live in the B&B that her sister, like, this is not that book. It starts out feeling that way, and it does not go in that direction, which I really appreciated. Nora is allowed to care about her career, allowed to care about being independent and living in the city and all of these things. And she doesn't want kids, and that's never brought up as like she's damaged because she doesn't want kids, like some books will do. And she really meets her perfect match in Charlie, and he understands her kind of innately for who she is, and he doesn't try to change her, and he doesn't try to convince her to do anything that she doesn't want to do. And I think that sounds really simple for a romance, and is not always what happens in the execution of them, I've found. But I think also what really got me about this book and what puts it so close to my heart is the plot line involving her sister. Because that plot line, and I won't get into any like specifics or spoilers of it, it talks a lot about change and how your life changes as you get older, and how your priorities shift, and how change is really hard. Nora really is struggling with the idea of change. And I read this book when I was pregnant. And I think there were some things about having a child that I maybe hadn't fully reckoned with, as far as how much of a life change it was going to be. Like, obviously, I think you know when you have a kid that your life is gonna look different, right? But I think there were a few things that I had a hard time reckoning with about the way that my life would change, that I needed kind of that perspective shift that happens for the characters in this book. And I was listening to the audiobook in the dark at night, laying in my bed, just sobbing, listening to the characters kind of come to those conclusions. And so it really emotionally impacted me, and it really made me think about life differently. And I know that sounds like very dramatic for this little like cartoon characters on the cover romance book, but that's how it made me feel. And I think sometimes you just have to go with how books make you feel when you're talking about them, because it might hit somebody else completely differently, and they might, not see it in that way. But that's how I took it, and that's how I interpreted it. And so yeah, that is, I will forever be thankful that I read the book when I read the book. The other aspect of it that is really wonderful is the book lovers of it all, like the title, because both Nora and Charlie are in this like book space, this publishing space, and so they talk about books a lot, and they talk about how much books mean to them and how much they matter and how much stories matter. And as a book lover myself, that really resonated with me. I love books about books, and I really especially love books about people who love books, because we're the best people, right? If you're watching this video, you're in that category. And so that book lovers are the best. So why would book lovers not be the best romance? Riddle me that. Okay, so next up, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about nonfiction. Nonfiction, I will admit, is not a category that is like my first go-to pick up, but I do try to read nonfiction as much as I feel called to, as I like to learn things. I like to learn things about the world, and I really like people's true stories. So I'm kind of more drawn to like memoirs and things that talk about people's lives in their own words specifically. One that I think should be required reading, particularly if you live in the US, but literally anywhere, I think, is Just Mercy by Bryan Stephenson. This book, to me, was incredibly impactful and incredibly powerful. And I think it is just a book that I wish more people would read and really absorb, because it's one thing to just read it, and it's another thing to really take it in. This book obviously is written by Bryan Stephenson, and he is, let me make sure I say this right, he's an attorney who founded the Equal Justice Initiative. And his whole legal career has been committed to helping defend people that have been caught up in the justice system of America, perhaps unfairly, perhaps with harsher sentences and harsher punishments because of their socioeconomic status, because of their race. And we have a real issue with that. And I think also another thing that it doesn't talk about on the back of here, but I found really impactful in this is people with disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities are also unfairly targeted by the system. And there's a lot of corruption, and there's a lot that is wrong with it. And so he talks about the death penalty specifically and people that are put on death row. We follow specifically one very prominent case, I think it was kind of prominent in the media too, of a man who was convicted, put on death row. And as you read about his story in here, you're like, the evidence was very, very shaky for this man being convicted. There was a lot of evidence to support that he didn't do the things that he was accused of, and yet he still got put on death row. And so that's kind of where this book opens up and where it closes out. It's kind of the framing device for the entire thing. And then Bryan Stephenson talks about how he became interested in this area of law, the things that he's learned from it, different cases that he's seen. And I think we could all aspire to be as compassionate and as caring as he is with people that, you know, a lot of people would disregard because of the things that they've done or the things that they've been accused of doing. And he really advocates for showing mercy, and that justice doesn't have to be retaliatory, doesn't have to be vengeance. That's not always justice. And it's especially not justice in a system that is not fair, and especially not fair to people in marginalized groups. And you can't guarantee that justice is actually being served in those situations. So I think I went into this book, Anti-Death Penalty. I went into this book knowing a lot about the kind of fallibility of the criminal justice system in America. So I went in with some background knowledge, but I came out with so much more. And I cried reading this book. I felt anger reading this book. I think it's just an incredible book. And it's like short enough where I think it's pretty accessible for a lot of people. And unfortunately with nonfiction, especially nonfiction kind of surrounding, I don't know, social justice issues, for lack of a better word, the people that pick it up may not be the people that need the message of it. But if it's something that you've ever even really considered of like, oh, do I believe in the death penalty? Do I think that that's okay? I would recommend reading this, because I think it really provides a lot of good talking points of why, if you are anti-death penalty, why you should remain so, and if you are wavering or even pro-death penalty, why you should maybe reconsider your position. So I guess maybe not for everybody, but I wish everybody would read it, because I think that the way that he views the world, if more people viewed the world that way, there could be some actual positive change accomplished. And yeah, so I don't know if that made any sense or if that was super rambling, but highly recommend. This is definitely my favorite nonfiction that I've read so far. Moving to something a little bit lighter. And when I say lighter, do we consider this lighter? Oh my God. Okay, so I am a big old scaredy cat. And so horror is definitely a genre that I'm not super well versed in. And of the few horror books that I have read, this is the one that I put on this list. And I think this is a 5-star book. So don't get me wrong. I'm not just like, I hate horror and this is the only one that I kind of like to know. I really did enjoy this book. Like, I don't have to really give you a synopsis of this, but I'll give you a little bit. Misery by Stephen King follows an author who gets stranded in a motor vehicle accident in a snowstorm and is rescued by a woman, Annie, who is something. And it, you know, she is the biggest fan of this author and his books in which the titular character of his novels is Misery, which is ironic given the things that he then goes through in this book. And I think, I mean, there is a reason that Stephen King is as like well-known and well-renowned as he is when it comes to horror. Like, I was reading this book, like, you know, kind of stressed out the whole time for what I knew was going to happen, and what, you know, I was witnessing happening. I knew going in what this book was, but what was interesting about it is that there were a lot more kind of thoughtful conversations, particularly about authorship and kind of fan culture in a way, of how much does the creator of a piece of media, of a piece of art, owe to its fans, right? And I think there were a lot of really interesting conversations about that in here. And one of my favorite kind of moments from this book is Annie talking about ending that is not fair to the reader, and how she's like, you have to play fair, right? When you are writing a plot twist, when you are writing something into a book, it can't be a cheat. It has to be fair. And meaning, like, you can't just have someone come left field to create an interesting plot device and not have it be connected to the rest of the book, and not have it be something that the reader doesn't feel cheated by happening. And I deeply feel that way. It's one of my only things that I agree with Annie on in this book, of plot twists that are introduced that are just like, what? Like, that doesn't make sense with what we know of the other characters. It doesn't make sense with the rest of the story. And it was purely for shock value. And I think this book really interestingly has kind of that meta conversation about things like that. And I know that this book was written in response to Stephen King's own experiences with fans who got really upset at him for a book series that he wrote that they didn't like, and that was not what they wanted from him. And I just think there's a lot of really interesting conversations in there about that, in addition to the chilling, like, bone-curdling, like, horror that is included in this as well. So I haven't really picked up more Stephen King after reading this. And so if you have any recommendations of, like, other Stephen King books that I like, if I like this one, let me know. But yeah, this is the one that's gonna win for the horror category. All right, next up, let's talk about mysteries, or specifically mysteries. If you watched my Best and Worst books of 2024, you will know that this series was very heavily featured in the mystery category. And indeed, I would consider this my favorite mystery series, like the series as a whole. I pulled out this book just because it's the first one. I don't know that it's necessarily my favorite, but in the series, but it's the one that got me into it. So I feel like that's the one that I want to feature. Well, I love a good mystery. I've gotten really into Agatha Christie, and she almost was the one that kind of made it to this spot. But really, when I think about my overall enjoyment, I have to put this one ahead of it, just because it's so much more than a mystery. We follow 4 senior citizens who live in a retirement community and like to go over the cold cases of, you know, different police files and things like that, and try to solve the mystery as like a club activity. And then a real mystery gets dropped in their lap, and they're like, you know what? We're gonna solve this one too. And these books are written with such humor and heart and love and care and tenderness. And all of that, plus a mystery that's really fun and engaging and smart, and keeps you on your toes, gives you all of those feelings that a good mystery should have, in addition to giving you these characters that are just mean the absolute world to you by the end of reading this book. Like, you come away just feeling such love towards these characters because they feel so real. They feel like real people. I cannot recommend them enough, and I won't go on too much about them just because I've already talked ad nauseum about our 4 characters in here. But like, I highly, highly recommend this series. And what's interesting too is a lot of people say they don't like the first book, but then they like the subsequent books in the series. And I'm like, I loved the first book, so I can't relate to that. But man, what a time, what a wild ride these books are. And if you have any interest, you know, the word like cozy mystery kind of gets thrown around, and I don't know if I would entirely put these books in that category, just because there are some darker things that kind of come up throughout this series, and you don't necessarily know, like in a cozy mystery, I feel like you kind of know that all of your main characters are going to be okay beginning to end. And I think you don't really necessarily know that with these books. So I don't know if I would entirely put it in that camp, but it is a kind of a gentler mystery. So if you are squeamish, if like the idea of like true crime and it being too real freaks you out a little bit, these might be a good option for you. So yeah, The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman and all of the subsequent books in the series definitely top my list in the mystery department. Okay, so I did want to do a mention for YA, young adult. I know that's not like a genre in and of itself, but I do think that it is kind of a subsection of my reading, and it's similar to nonfiction where I don't pick up a ton of them, but when they hit, and this one hit. So my favorite young adult book is Monday's Not Coming by Tiffany D. Jackson. And it feels weird to say my favorite because reading this book was a harrowing experience, but it was such an important book and an important experience. And so I think about this book a lot. I mentioned it in my last video when I was in my 2025 releases video, because Tiffany D. Jackson is coming out with a new book this year. And I mentioned this book of like how I think about it a lot. And that remains to be true. I don't even remember when I read this, but it's definitely been a few years since I read it, and I still think about it a lot. So Monday's Not Coming follows this girl named Claudia, and her best friend Monday has disappeared, essentially. She's not showing up to school, and Claudia is having a hard time tracking her down and finding her. And she's expressing concern about Monday being missing to all of these adults in her life, and nobody is taking it seriously. And so there's kind of a mystery surrounding where's Monday, you know, and then we go back and we kind of learn a little bit more about their relationship and about their past together. Claudia is really just trying to find her friend. She voices her concern to all these adults that do not seem concerned or do not help. And the reason that they're not super concerned is because Monday is Black. She's a young Black girl, but she is treated she's treated as if she's grown, and she comes from a lower socioeconomic background. And so her mom is poor, her mom is argumentative, and no one really wants to deal with her, and so no one really investigates it too closely. And this is the reality for young Black girls. So often there are so many young Black girls who go missing, and the amount of attention media, school, society, and otherwise that is devoted to finding these girls who go missing is so much less than when a young white girl goes missing. And this book really dives into that. And I think it's really hard to read, but it's really important to talk about. And I think the biggest thing with this book is there is a plot twist that happens that it had me absolutely I had to pick my jaw up off the ground. It was so shocking and horrifying, but so well constructed and so well done. And this is a horror book without kind of the title of horror, because it's about real life horror and about things that really happen and the way that they are addressed and the way that they are seen by society. And it's just it's such an intense experience. The audiobook is really good. That's how I experienced it the first time. And I definitely wouldn't broadly recommend this, because just, you need to look up content warnings for this one. I didn't, and it definitely shook me a little bit. Yeah, that is definitely at the top of my YA list. All right, next up, we'll talk about historical fiction. And I don't really know if this book completely falls into the historical fiction category, but I don't know what else to call it. Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I love this book with my whole being. It is my perfect book for me. I'm someone who grew up listening to 60s, 70s rock and getting really invested in those artists and those musicians because of my dad. And so a book that is about a fictionalized version of that and the pitfalls of it, and like the pitfalls of fame and the struggles of being an artist, like it's perfect for me. It's perfect for me. This book is also really interestingly written because it is documentary, like fake documentary style. So there's no descriptions, there's no like prose really. It's just what the characters are saying to the person recording this documentary, and the things that they choose not to say, and the way that they choose to present information. And when you hear different people's sides of the same event, like that is how the story gets told, which I think is just an impressive way to tell a story. You have to set the scene with a lot fewer words. And I think that Taylor Jenkins Reid does just a really incredible job of that. And if you like the movie Almost Famous, which is one of my favorite movies, I would recommend this, and vice versa. If you've read Daisy Jones and the Six and you've not seen Almost Famous, run. Go watch that movie right now. Sorry, that was very intense. Go watch that movie. And I did watch the TV show adaptation of this, and I thought it was good, but the book is better. Not to be annoying about it, but the book is so much better. Taylor Jenkins Reid just has a way of doing this kind of historical fiction, but it's like a fictional universe almost, because all of these celebrities that she made up are interconnected in her books from different decades. And I think she just does such a great job of it. So yeah, Daisy Jones and the Six, it's about love, it's about music, it's about fame, it's about betrayal, it's about just so many different things. And when I say it's about love, I don't mean that it is just a love story, in the typical way that we would think of. It's one of those books. I read it and then I reread it, and the reread didn't lose anything for me. Like, I still just loved it as much as the first time that I experienced it. And I think that's a really cool thing that happens. So yeah, Daisy Jones and the Six, highly recommend. Okay, so next up, we'll talk about just general literary fiction. And in that category, by far my favorite author that I have found is Fredrik Backman. And I think it's hard to pick, but I think my favorite of his books is Beartown. I'm going to be talking primarily about the first one. It is a trilogy. There are 3 books set in kind of the same town. I do think, especially the first book, can be read as a standalone if you're not into series. But Beartown follows a small town called Beartown, where the town is kind of struggling economically, financially. There's not a lot of tourism. There's not a lot going on. And one thing that they've kind of pinned their hopes on collectively is this hockey team. It has a bunch of like high school aged boys, and it's like a recreational team, but it represents the town. And they have the opportunity to play in the finals and potentially win, whatever the championship is for hockey. And the town has like pinned all of their hopes on this. They're very excited about it. They think it can bring tourism and jobs and all sorts of things. And then one of the players on the team perpetrates a sexual assault against the daughter of the coach of the team. And the rest of the book is just the fallout of that and how it ripples through the town, how it affects everybody in the town in some way, how different people respond to that act of violence. And I think the thing for me about Fredrik Backman is his level of empathy with characters and writing characters. There are like main characters in the books, but no character in his books is unimportant, and no character is treated as if they don't have their own backstory and wants and desires and trials in their life. And he does a good job of showing empathy towards all of the characters without necessarily condoning or excusing their actions. Besides like the main inciting event that happens, there are choices made by other people in the town that are, questionable. And the way that he kind of addresses the reasoning behind these choices and the fallout from these choices, like I always find his books to have such care put into them. And I find the writing to be really beautiful, which is so interesting because Fredrik Backman is Swedish, so these books are translated. So shout out, let me pull up, who's the translator of this book? Beartown's translator is Neil Smith, so props to him for translating these books so well, because they hit me in such a profound way, which is just incredible given that they are going through kind of that 1 degree of translation to get to me. So, I think Fredrik Backman in general is my rec. Beartown is the book that brought me to him, and I think is the one that has most profoundly impacted me. And so that's why it belongs right here on this list. Okay, so next, let's talk about sci-fi. My sci-fi preferences tend to be dystopian. I am very interested in the end of the world, the end of civilization as we know it. I don't know why. Probably because of the Hunger Games, which, I'm not talking about any of like my childhood favorites or books. All of the books on this list are books that kind of, that I came to from like 2020 onward. But if I was talking about childhood favorites, Hunger Games would definitely be on that list. But we have to, if we're talking about dystopian books, we have to talk about the queen herself, Miss Octavia E. Butler, and Parable of the Sower. Also Parable of the Talents, but this one is obviously what kind of sealed the deal for me. This is the first book in that duology. And in this book, we are in an apocalyptic world, post-apocalyptic world, essentially. And there are raging fires, wildfires in California. There is a president who is fascist and terrible, and for some reason that's just resonating with people right now. Who knows why? It's a mystery. But I read this book back in 2020 or maybe 2021, and I think it's just incredible. We follow Lauren, who is our protagonist, and she basically has to leave her home, leave her kind of safe, or as safe as it can be, community, due to, certain events that make it unsafe to continue there. And she has to create a life for herself. And in the midst of this, she also creates a religion, essentially. She views herself as kind of as a almost like a prophet, I guess, where she just feels like she sees what's happening and she sees the world a lot more clearly than everybody else. And she also has hyper empathy, which causes her to kind of feel the pain of others. And that plays a really interesting role in the way that this story unfolds. And it's basically, this book is told in like journal entries. And so a lot of people are like, Octavia Butler was a prophet and she knew she knew the future and she knew what was going to happen. And there are some very striking parallels to our current situation, our current climate crises and economic crises and all those different things. And I think Octavia E. Butler was just really good at recognizing the patterns of history and knowing that we were doomed to repeat them. So I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily that she was magical and could see the future. I think she just was able to look at different patterns in history and kind of see the trajectory that we're headed on. But it's just a really powerful book. The relationships in this book are really powerful. The harshness of the world. And I mean, I think the thing with dystopian that always really draws me in is this thought process of what would I do? What would I do in this situation? What would I do if this happened? And kind of seeing how different people react differently to things. So this book, I think now more than ever, is a very important and powerful read. And it definitely tops the list of like sci-fi dystopian for me. And I've read quite a few of those because it is a special interest of mine. But this one is definitely, I think in a lot of ways, I'm not saying it was like the first dystopian book ever written, but it definitely created a lot of the like tropes of the genre. And it is definitely one of the most impactful that I've read. So, okay, so next we're going to talk about fantasy, and this is where I cheated a little bit, because I said I was going to pick one book from every genre, but, okay, so here's my defense, okay? I've picked two. One is a standalone, and one is, there's someone walking their dog out there. They're gone. What was I? I was justifying my breaking of my own rules that I set for myself, which will happen probably a lot if you continue watching this channel. I picked a standalone and a series because in my mind, I feel like the standalone fantasies that I pick up are very, very different. Like it almost feels like a different genre to the like fantasy series that I read, because my fantasy standalones that I read typically tend to be more like real world or historical with some magic involved, versus a lot of the fantasy series I gravitate towards are more like high fantasy. We're in a completely different world. So I feel like it counts and you can't tell me not to. So here we are. So for the standalone fantasy, I have The Once and Future Witches by Alix E. Harrow. Alix E. Harrow is one of my favorite authors. I've loved almost everything she's put out there. Crazily enough, like her 30-page novella called The Six Deaths of the Saint, I almost put ahead of this one. Like, it's that good. But this is definitely my favorite. And this follows this is like kind of a more historical fantasy. So we have three sisters who are witches and get involved with the suffragist movement. And it explores all of the different ways. Like it's just, this is the book where that meme of Little Women where they're just like, women, that's what this book is. It's about sisterhood. It's about friendship. It's about the shared experience of womanhood, and it's done in a very inclusive way without being preachy. Okay? Like, I would say this is a fantastic example of intersectional feminism without it being like, you know, told to you. I think it's just included in this book, and I think it's a really nice thing to see. The magic in this book is really interesting. Got like kind of the spells that they use intertwined in here. They're kind of in like a rhyming format. There's a lot of really good, like, it feels like a very real history of things, with this like witchy element to it. Like, this is my perfect witchy book. It's, you know, the witchiness is very influential to the story. The spells are like really interesting and well conceived. I think all of the characters, especially our three sisters, have such distinct and interesting personalities, and it just makes you feel like this collective experience of being a woman. I don't know how else to describe it. I really don't. And I think that it accomplishes so many different things so well. And I love Alix Harrow's writing. I know it might not be for everybody because she does kind of have a little bit more of a conversational tone of writing, I guess we could call it. I think this book is less of that, though, because of the historical nature of it. So yeah, I love this one. I love all of Alix Harrow's books, but this one is my favorite. And then I'll try to be brief as I talk about this because, again, in my Best and Worst Books of 2024 video, I talked at length about this series. This is the Greenbone Saga. I'm holding up the final book, Jade Legacy. It comprises of Jade City, Jade War, and Jade Legacy. And this series is just so good. It takes place in a fictional world where jade is, like, the mineral is harnessed and used for its magical purposes. It gives people essentially superpowers where they can, you know, fight really well, heal things, run really fast, etc., you know, that kind of thing. And it follows specifically one family who is a very powerful, comprised of very powerful jade holders, jade users, and their journey as we learn about the different power struggles and power dynamics involved within the family itself, and then within the country where jade is found naturally, and then within the wider world and how different countries and different powers that be, you know, try to gain access to this power. And it is just a really compelling and interesting story. I mean, Saga, I felt like I had watched like 7 seasons of a TV show by the time I finished this book, this series, because there's so much in there. And it talks about so many different things about family and honor and friendship and your legacy and what you leave behind and what you want that to be and how you want to be remembered, as well as just how you want to live your life, what's important to you, what are your values, how important is this power versus the people in your life, how important are the people in your life versus a power that's going to outlive them. And it just, this series is everything. Like, it's got everything that you could possibly want. Political maneuverings, plotting and scheming to be ahead of somebody else. And Fonda also does a really good job of demonstrating empathy for all of the characters, including the characters that are kind of more minor, the characters that you at first glance kind of are like, ugh, this is just a bad guy, right? One thing that I saw an interview with her talking about this series, and she said she could very easily write the main antagonist of this series. She could flip the script easily and write books from that that antagonist perspective and make them into the protagonist. And you can really get a sense of that. You understand that their motivations so well, even though they're at odds with the main core group that you're following. And I was hooked, like, instantly from book one. And it caused me anxiety. It caused me great emotional distress. But it ultimately was just such a fun and good reading experience. So that's my favorite, like, series, fantasy series. The last book that I'm going to talk to you about is the blueprint for Gothic fiction, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I read this book for the first time in 2020, and then I immediately reread it a few months later in 2020, and then I reread it in 2021. I love this book, and I'm not really sure why, because it is, my typical tastes lean towards stories that are filled with a lot of hope, a lot of, like, seeing the goodness in humanity, and this is kind of the opposite of that. Because this follows characters that are awful. They're awful people. They do awful things to each other, to others, and it is obviously a lot of times pitched as a love story, and it is not that. It is an examination of toxic relationships, toxic family structures, abuse, cycles of abuse, and how those manifest. It's got kind of a feeling of being haunted, both in a kind of literal sense of, like, is there actually ghosts? Are they actually being haunted? And a metaphorical sense of you're haunted by your past actions. You're haunted by the choices made by yourself and those around you. The atmosphere is just, I mean, you know the vibe, the gloomy moors, fog rolling in, kind of like today, a little gloomy outside today. I mean, every time anything Gothic is pitched, I'm like, it gets compared to Wuthering Heights, like it's Wuthering Heights adjacent. Anytime something with, like, toxic, like a toxic love story is pitched, it's compared to Wuthering Heights. Like, this is the blueprint. This is the blueprint. And I love it. I love the framing device of this story being told to someone, and we're kind of going back in time to discover it. I love everything about it. To me, it's like, it's, if usually when people ask me what my favorite book is, this is the one that I would typically say, not to sound pretentious, but just because it is. And I mean, I will address the elephant in the room of the movie coming out with Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi, and I'm going to reserve my judgment until I've seen that movie. And I think what I'm going to do is do a sneaky little reread of this, because of course I will, before going to see that movie, so I can really pick it apart and tell you everything that's wrong with it. I didn't really go into a synopsis here. I feel kind of silly doing that, but we follow the tragic story of Kathy and Heathcliff and their relationship and what they mean to each other and what they do to each other, and how that impacts, how all of the decisions that they make impact their future and their future generations, and how the decisions that were made for them also inform those choices, and how their own personalities and their own inability to not be raging narcissists impacts them and the world around them. So that is the classic that I would most recommend to people, and is one that I truly love. Yeah, so there you have it. Those are the top favorite books that I love at this point in time. The list is flexible. The list changes all the time as I read new books and as I, get further away from books that I've loved in the past. But the ones that I just mentioned are ones that have really stuck with me, and, stayed ever present in my mind, even if it's been a few years since I've read them. Please let me know what your favorite books are in the comments, if you agree with me on any of these choices. Obviously, I love when people agree with me, but if you disagree, I'm happy to hear that too. But I also just love getting recommendations from people. So if there's books that you feel really passionately about, please let me know. And like, subscribe, share the video, do all of the things. And thank you for being here, and thank you for watching.